Battlefield Z Silent Run. A Battlefield Z Legend. By Chris Lowry. Chapter 1. Not fair, Bob grumbled. I said not it. Shut up, Bob, Steve said. Go to sleep. Bob rolled over, still muttering under his breath. It only took a moment for him to start snoring in a soft wheeze. Stephen envied him. He feared sleep would be long in coming. Events from the night replayed in his mind. His mom bitten. His mom trying to kill him. Running until he couldn't breathe. Finding Emma. Saving her. And almost dying again and again as creatures from humanity's darkest nightmares tried to kill him. Kill them. But they were safe now. Safe for the moment. Bob snorted and shifted as he rolled over on the floor. Steve wished it was THD simple for him. But he knew it was going to be a long night. He opened his eyes to a morning sky out of the window and the smell of coffee filling the air. Steve got out of bed and slipped his faded jeans over his boxer briefs. He skipped his shoes, since that would require waking Bob and he wanted to avoid that for as long as he could. He twisted the knob and tried to remember if the door squeaked as he pulled it open. The hinges were silent as he made his escape. Stuart sat at the table, an old mug clenched in his gnarled hands. Help yourself, Emma's grandfather nodded to 4 more mugs set on the counter by the automatic coffee maker. Steve poured a cup, added cream and joined Stuart at the table in a nook by a bay window that overlooked the backyard. I normally read the paper with my morning coffee, the old man explained. But no paper this morning. His sharp eyes regarded Steve as if it was his fault. We've been in this house for 30 years and in all that time, the delivery hasn't missed. Not one day. Stuart took a long sip from his mug and stared at Steve over the rim. The boy shifted in the seat, hardwood digging into his flesh. I'll pick one up while I'm in town, said Stuart. You're going to town? Steve hissed. I don't think that's a good idea. You think zombies are going to get me? Stuart scoffed. There's a better explanation for it. Probably a couple of kids hopped up on the wacky weed and getting paranoid. Another sip. Another look. They're real, Steve swallowed, his cup of coffee ignored as it cooled in his hand. Sir. Stuart steadied him for a few moments in silence. You don't look like a pothead. I'm not, Steve defended. Stuart drained his mug. I'll be back before the others are up, he said as he stood. I'll gas up my truck for the trip to take you 3 home, and get my paper. You could call them. Steve searched for a way to keep the old man at the table. The paper. You could tell them it wasn't delivered. Tried, Stuart grunted. No answer. It must be too early. Even he sounded like he didn't believe that. Carriers were at the paper by 4 a.m. to get most deliveries in the driveway before dawn. He glanced at the clock on the wall. I'll be back in 10 minutes. Please. Sir, Steve fumbled. Wait here. Don't go. Stuart grunted with a low noise in the back of his throat. He ignored the plea and walked through the door to the garage. Steve stared after him, debated whether he should try to physically restrain the man. Not that he could. Stuart was a thick man, the kind of grandfather that looked like a cross between a mountain man and Yeti. If he had made up his mind, he wouldn't be swayed. Thinking about his size gave Steve a slight feeling of relief. Maybe the man could take care of himself. He took a sip of coffee and grimaced. It was cold. Steve poured a fresh cup to sit at the table and wait. Chapter 2. Is that coffee? Bob shuffled into the room, digging into the corner of his eyes with a knuckle. He poured a mug without asking and took a small sip. Hot? He plopped into a seat across from Steve and blew on the scalding liquid. How did you sleep? Comfortable in the bed? The floor sucked, by the way. Tonight, I get the bed. I'm calling it. Bob, Steve blew out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. What? I can call it. We might not be here tonight? Why not? Where are we going? Home, said June as she walked in from the bedroom she shared with Stuart. She cinched up her robe as she studied the 2 boys sitting at the table in her kitchen nook. You're up early. I let Emma sleep in. She looked exhausted. Where's Stuart? He went to get gas and a paper, Steve said. A paper? June prepared her own coffee, creamer first and stirred it with the tip of her finger. It wasn't delivered, he said, Steve explained. Curious, June answered. She made her way to the back of the table and sat with them. Did you boys sleep? Yes, thank you, Steve answered. He was comfortable, Bob sulked. Chapter 3. What happened to your arm? Daryl bit me? June crunched her eyebrows together and shot them up almost to her hairline. I shit you not, hon. The son of a bitch came out of the work bay and bit me. June bustled into the bathroom. I have a first aid kit, let me get some ointment. Steve and Bob exchanged a look before turning back to Stuart. Sir? Steve stumbled through the words. What he wants to know is, was Daryl a zombie? Bob interrupted. Stuart snorted. Of course, he wasn't a zombie. Then why did he bite you, Grandpa? Emma said in a voice that trembled. Tears welled in her eyes, but had yet to spill over to her pale cheeks. Here, said June. She came back with 3 bottles of ointment and a bandage. What did he look like? Who? Asked Stuart. The zombie. Bob tried to keep the exasperation from his voice. There are no zombies, Stuart growled. Ouch. He flinched away from June as she lathered his forearm in brown antibacterial liquid. Hush you big baby, she slapped him on the shoulder. What did he look like, Grandpa? Emma tried to steer him back on topic. He looked like Daryl. Was he rotting? Moaning? Did he walk with his arms out like this? Bob demonstrated a stiff-legged Frankenstein's monster walk with arms held out in front of him like the mummy. Or a zombie on the hunt for brains. Nonsense, Stuart huffed. June felt his forehead. You've got a fever. I feel fine. He stood up from the table and wobbled, almost pitching to the floor before he caught himself on the worn wood. Whoa, Steve lunged to help hold him upright as Bob backed away. You need to lie down, said June. I think I need to rest, Stuart said in a halting voice. He's going Z, Bob muttered under his voice. Shut up, knob, Emma hissed. He shot her a hurt look that she ignored as Steve and June helped Stuart back into the master bedroom just off the kitchen. Steve came back after a moment and closed the door behind him. She's tucking him in, said Steve. He glanced between Emma and Bob. How long ago do you think it happened? 15 minutes, said Bob. That's what I was thinking about. 15 minutes before the symptoms take effect. Actually, it's effect. Seriously, knob? Steve collapsed in the chair. It's the end of the world, but that doesn't mean we forget how to speak English, Bob corrected. I'm speaking English, Steve sighed. Emma sat down and put her head in her arms. Her shoulders heaved as she sobbed in silence. Steve reached over and put a hand on her forearm, just to let her know he was there. Bob grabbed a seat and put his hand on the other side. Steve shook his head as June came out. He's asleep, she said, a perplexed look on her face. He's been sick a dozen times I can remember, but never took a nap. I can't remember him ever laying down in the middle of the day. She went to the sink and began to make a fuss over the coffee mugs as she cleaned them. She was deliberate in her movements, precise and careful, as if clean mugs were the only thing that could save the world. Steve thought he saw a tear course down her cheek, but didn't know if he should try to comfort the woman or remain where he was with Emma. Do you think Daryl had an illness? June squeaked. I think so, Grandma. Emma sat up and swiped the tears off her cheeks. I'll just go check on him. She set the coffee mugs in the rack to dry and went back into the bedroom. Steve noticed she left the door open. I can't kill your grandfather, Em, Bob whispered. It would put a real damper on our relationship. We don't have a relationship, Bob. He tried not to look offended and failed. Not yet. Not ever. She bit back more tears. I know you say that now, but we are rapidly approaching a last man on earth type situation, and if we reach that point, I do not want you to think of me as the guy who shot your grandpa. Shut up, knob. Stop calling me that, Bob pouted. You never called me that before. You never threatened to kill my grandpa before. I'll do it, Steve said in a voice almost too low to hear. You will? They both glanced at him in confusion and surprise. He shrugged. I don't want to do it, he said. But it has to be done. Emma reached over and gripped his hand in hers, squeezed it. Steve relished her soft skin next to his, and the look she gave him. Bob glared at her reaction. Wait a minute. I'll shoot your grandpa, he shouted. I'll do it. The hell you will. June stepped out of the bedroom and racked a shell into a short-barreled shotgun. Grandma? Emma, get away from these hooligans. Your grandfather was afraid they were a bad influence on you. Grandma, wait. Now hold on, June. Steve held up both hands. Don't call me June, you murderer. I haven't killed anyone. Steve screamed. Actually, said Bob. There was that guy in camo. Knob. Emma and Steve shouted at the same time. Stuart lunged from the bedroom and sank his teeth into June's neck. Her finger twitched. The shotgun went off, blew out the bay window behind Steve in a shattering explosion of glass and gun smoke. Emma screamed. Bob shrieked. Steve lunged from the chair, pounded across the linoleum floor and slammed into June and Stuart. The shotgun clattered to the floor and their momentum carried all three backwards into the master bedroom. Steve flipped over and crawled out as fast as he could. He rolled up and jerked the door closed behind him, clinging to the doorknob. They listened to June's cries that turned into a gurgle after just a moment, almost drowned out by Emma's sobs. "I guess no one has to shoot him now," said Bob. Chapter 4. "What are we going to do?" Emma said through her tears. Her zombie grandfather scratched and moaned against the closed bedroom door. "We're going to be quiet." Bob put a finger against the tip of his nose. "Lock it." Steve backed away from the door. He began opening drawers in the kitchen, searching. "What are you doing?" Bob hissed. "Looking for rope. Nobody keeps rope in their house." "Something then," said Steve, his voice going up one octave. His wild eyes roamed over the counters, the open drawers, the two people seated at the table. "Anything. Why do you need a rope?" The zombie hit the door again. Steve pointed. "Tie the doorknob. So, it can't get out." "Like shoelaces?" Bob asked in confusion. "Yes." Steve snapped his fingers and pointed at Bob. "Exactly." The Z hit the door harder, the moans doubled as a second body joined the first. "Grandma," Emma sobbed. "Come on." Steve motioned for Bob to follow him to the spare bedroom where they had slept. "I don't think it's time for a nap," Bob muttered as he followed Steve down the hall. The room looked different in daylight. Old furniture, thin curtains. A long dresser by the wall that created a narrow space between the bed and drawers. No wonder Bob had complained. It would have been tight. Steve jerked open the closet door. "Eureka! Eureka! Who says that?" Bob said from behind him. "I did. You just heard me say it." He rummaged through the bottom of the closet and tossed 12 pairs of sneakers onto the bed. "Laces," he ordered as he began to remove the shoestrings from the shoes. 12, Bob said in wonder. "Who needs 12 pairs of shoes?" "One for each day of the week," Steve answered, distracted as he concentrated on ripping the strings from the eyelets. "And then some." Steve rushed to the kitchen with Bob in tow, laces strung over both of their shoulders. The Z had grown silent in their absence and Emma put her finger to her nose to tell them to be quiet. Steve nodded. He bent in front of the door and began tying the end of one of the laces around the narrow neck of the knob. His finger slipped, knuckles cracking against the solid wood door with a thunk. The Z slammed into the other side of the panel. It rattled in the frame. Emma squeaked, or it might have been Bob. Steve fell back. "Move," said Bob. His fingers wove an expert knot that created a small noose. He slipped it over the knob and sensed it tight. He double-knotted a second string to the first and repeated the noose on the door knob to the garage door in the kitchen. "That's why you become a scout?" he crowed in triumph. "Yeah, well, good job," said Steve as he got up and brushed himself off. Bob looked at him in surprise, his wit failed at the unexpected compliment. Steve took a coffee mug from the drying rack and topped it off from the cold pot. He poured the remnants into a second cup and set it in front of Emma at the table. Bob joined them as they listened to the moaning struggle of the Z against the door. "What now?" Emma looked at Steve. "I was hoping you would know." She shrugged, took a sip and grimaced. "It was my idea to come here. I did this." She glanced at the door. "No," said Steve. "You didn't start this thing, whatever it is. I brought us here. I did that." She pointed to the door. "Could you?" Bob asked. "Could I what?" "Stop him? Could you have kept your grandfather from going to town?" "I should have tried." Bob shook his mane of curly hair. "I'm not saying you couldn't, but he's old and you're just a kid." "So?" "So, old people don't listen to kids. Especially if they think we're full of bullshit." Steve snickered. "He did think we were high." "Really?" Bob tilted his head to one side. "I would too," said Emma. "If I hadn't seen all of it with my own eyes." "I have never even tried it," Bob said. "Then we're back to what now?" said Steve. "I don't want to try it," Bob said in a raised voice. The zombies hit the door again, scratching, moaning. "I can't stay here," Emma shuddered. "Then the plan is we leave," said Steve. "Great. Where do we go?" Bob asked. "We need to find somebody who knows what's going on," said Emma. "We know what's going on. Zombies." That's what's going on. I mean someone in charge. We tried that with the cops, remember? It didn't turn out so well. Maybe the army? Seriously? Asked Bob. I don't know. No one is making a decision and we need to do something. She glanced over her shoulder at the master bedroom door. We need to get out of here. That's decided then. We're leaving, said Bob. Where? Army base? Steve studied Emma's tear-swollen face. Why army? No duh, Bob sneered. They have guns. Steve shrugged. A lot of people have guns, said Steve. But the army has training, Bob said in defense. Do you think they trained for this? Not for this exactly, said Emma. But they might have plans for a national emergency. Steve grunted. What? Said Emma. Do you think this has gone national? Bob asked. Her eyes moved from Steve to Bob and back again. Yes. Shit, Bob let out a long slow breath. Yeah, well we don't know, do we? Steve stammered. Do we? It could be confined to Delano, Bob said. But come on, you know nothing ever happens there. Until now, Steve laughed under his breath. Which is why I think it's national. Okay, then we need to prepare. Steve pushed back from the table. Knob, get all the food we can carry. Bob stood with him and started grabbing cans from the pantry. Be honest. You put me in charge of food because of my weight, he grinned. You shouldn't joke about that, Emma said. Why not? Said Bob. I'm husky. He knows it. I know it. You know it. It just feels wrong. It's okay, Emma. I like me. Hell, my mom would tell you I love me. Besides, I beat him to the punch. Steve shrugged. I know where the food is, Steve said. I just need her to help find any camping gear. Oh. Steve and Emma left Bob to collect all the food while they began to search the house. Chapter 5. Not bad, Knob grinned as they stood over a stack of gear and food spread out on the table. Grandparents, Emma sobbed and wiped her leaking nose with the back of her hand. They always had so much. The table had 34 cans of different food, plus boxed pasta, peanut butter and anything that didn't have to stay refrigerated. Steve added a tent, 3 sleeping bags plus pillows and comforters from the guest bedroom, which Bob eyed dubiously, as if that's what they were going to make him sleep on. There was a simple metal stove with a cast iron skillet Emma put on top, plus a lantern. Is that it? Bob asked. It's enough to get us started, said Steve. Look, we don't know what's out there, said Bob. But we know what's in here, Steve said in a soft voice. He nodded his head toward the bedroom door. They could hear the duo behind it, scratching, mumbling, shuffling. Emma followed his look, sniffed and wiped her nose with the back of her hand. I can't stay here, she said. Besides, said Steve, the government has to be doing something. They have a plan for things like this, don't they? Are you asking me or telling me? Steve shrugged. I think they planned for things like Russian invasions or Korean nukes or EMPs. Bob picked through the food on the table. Emma noticed he was dividing it into tiny meals. But a zombie apocalypse? No one expects a zombie apocalypse. That's because they aren't real, Emma said quickly. Weren't real, I mean. Yeah, said Steve. What made this happen? Why is this happening? I don't know, Bob sighed. They stared in silence at the supplies spread on the table for a few moments. Outside, the world was mostly silent. Which is to say the world had noise in it, the noise of nature, birds and insects and the wind in the trees. But they couldn't hear the distant buzz of engines, which had been a part of the background so long, it seemed a piece of nature. We're doing this, Steve said, though it came out more like a question than a declaration. He ran his hand along the canvas bag that held the tent. The state park is north of here, he said. We can get in there, get one of the camping spaces and we should be okay. Out there? Bob scoffed. With nothing but the tent walls to keep them out. That's the beauty of it, Knob. The park is going to be empty this time of the year. It's a weekday for one thing, and the other is no one is thinking about hiding in a campground. You hope. Steve shrugged. Do you have a better idea? Bob thought about it for a moment, the skin between his bushy eyebrows creased in concentration. Then he shook his mane of hair. Not any good ones. I still think the army base is a good idea. Steve nodded. I'm not disagreeing with you. We should go there. But later, after this has settled down some. He turned to Emma. What do you think? She shrugged. Any plan is a good plan, she said. We just need to get out of here. Chapter 6. It took a half hour to load the SUV. Steve stowed the camping gear in one side of the rear compartment and the food on the other. Bob watched him divide the food into small sections. What are you doing? Steve held up a can and moved it to one of the small piles. Dividing by expiration date, Steve explained. We'll eat the stuff that's closest to the date first. Huh? Bob said. Steve stopped, a can in his hand. What? Bob shrugged. Nothing. What is it, Knob? It's just, that's a smart thing to do. And you don't think I'm smart? Not even close, Bob grinned. Maybe not, said Steve. But your stomach is going to think I'm a genius if I keep us from getting poisoned. Bob patted his gut. Yeah, I've got a lot to thank here. Steve looked at him and shook his head. Then he stared around to make sure Emma was still in the house. Listen, Knob, this isn't going to be easy. I know. So you need to take it seriously. I am, Bob snarled. I don't think you are, Steve said in a slow, patient voice. I think you're acting like you're in one of those stupid role-playing games you and the nerds like to play in the park. Live-action role-playing is not stupid, Bob snapped. I bet we were better prepared for something like this than the lacrosse team. Or anyone else for that matter. Steve shook his head. I don't think any of us was ready for this, Knob. But the curly-haired boy wouldn't give up so easily. You're wrong, Steve, he said. You and the rest of the jocks may not have thought about something like this, but trust me, the geeks and nerds sure as hell have. Thought about it, planned for it, played at it. I mean, we didn't go full-on prepper mode, but all that stuff we did in the park, that was battle. I'm prepared for battle. Steve steadied him as he divided up the last of the cans and stowed them. He double-checked the back of the truck and closed the door. I think you're prepared, he said. I'm ready, Knob tried to keep his voice from squeaking as he said it. Me too, Emma stepped out of the house and pulled the door closed behind her. The keys dangling from her finger jingled. I'll drive, she said. Shotgun, Bob shouted. Steve ignored him and climbed into the front passenger seat. Hey, Bob whined. I called shotgun. I heard you, Knob, said Steve. Here you go. Steve passed him the shotgun from inside the house and a box of shells. Bob turned it over in his hands. How do you load it? Yeah, we're ready, Steve muttered. Emma started the car and dropped it in gear. She drove out of the drive and let the tears drip from the corner of her eyes as she stared in the rearview mirror at a place she would never see again. Chapter 7. The entrance to the state park was blocked with a ranger's pickup truck pulled across the road. I think that means no entry, Bob said as he leaned between the seats to look through the windshield. The gate's still open, Steve pointed. This is just to scare people off. It's working, said Emma. We can drive around, said Steve. He motioned her to the strip of muddy grass along the side of the road where there was room enough to pass behind the stalled pickup truck. Whoever put that there left it for a reason, Bob said. Yeah, and if it's making us second-guess going in, then it's making other people do the same, said Steve. We'll be safe in there. We'll leave tire tracks, Bob pointed out. Steve turned in his seat to both of them. I don't know why they put a truck across the road. Maybe it was to keep people out. Maybe it was because they were in a hurry and just left it. Doors shut, Emma said. Whatever. I think we should just go in. Bob glanced up and down the deserted road. So far, they hadn't seen anyone else, which was spooky. No other cars, no other people. Nothing. The road looked abandoned, lost and forgotten. Emma considered the patch of grass beside the truck and dropped the SUV into the lowest gear. She pressed the gas and slithered around the edge. The back end threatened to fishtail once, but she turned into the slide and they bounced back onto the blacktop leading into the pine forest. Be ready, she said in a low voice laced with fear. Bob gripped their seats so tight, his knuckles popped wide against his skin as he peered up the road, searching the shadows for threats. Do you know where we're going? He whispered. You don't have to whisper, Knob, Steve said, his voice almost as low. Then why are you? Steve didn't answer. He pointed to a wooden sign the size of a large table bolted between two posts. It showed a painted map of the campgrounds and state park where it brushed against the side of a lake. Steve directed Emma along the left path which swung them closer to the body of water. I think that would be better, don't you? Emma shrugged. If it's not, we're blaming you, said Bob. She drove slow, tires crunching over pine needles. The road opened up to a cleared campground on the shore of the lake. "Guess we're not the only ones," said Emma. 24 tents, RVs and trailers lined the designated camping spots, with tents and tarps thrown up in bare spaces between them. People stopped and watched the SUV as it pulled to the edge of the campsites. The lake shimmered in the background under the mid-morning sun. A park ranger stepped out of the group holding a shotgun. He didn't aim it at the SUV, but his finger was on the trigger. "Shit," said Bob. "You got us busted." "Just be cool," said Steve. "Roll down your window." A second man joined the ranger, then a third. They advanced on the SUV, spreading out as they walked. "Kill the engine," the ranger called out. Emma cut the motor and they sat there listening to the tick of the metal as it started to cool. The ranger kept the shotgun ready as he came up to her window and looked inside. "You're just a bunch of kids," he said in wonder. "How did you get in?" "Drove around the truck," Emma squeaked as she stared at the weapon not quite pointed at them, but in their general direction. The ranger glanced up the road. "Well, that was stupid," he drawled. "Told you," said Bob, more of a whimper than a matter-of-fact tone. Chapter 8. "You can set up over there," the ranger pointed to a bare spot in the packed dirt between a larger newer-looking RV and an ancient rusty camper. Emma didn't argue with him, just pulled the SUV into the narrow space between the two campers and put it in park. "What now?" she whispered as she stared through the windshield. The large RV was blocking the rest of the people. Most had gone back to what they were doing when the SUV arrived, but a few were staring. She didn't know if it was fear, anger or both. Maybe wonder at how 3 kids had survived when so many hadn't. Or what they were doing here in a place they thought was protected. Emma didn't know. And not knowing scared her. "Tent," said Steve. "I say we take a vote." Bob leaned between the front seats. "What are we voting on?" Emma asked. "Leadership." "I think the ranger's in charge," said Steve, making a face like he thought Bob was stupid. "I know that," Bob scoffed. "I meant with us." "Why do we need a leader with us if he's the leader out there?" Bob looked through the dirty windows at the campground and shivered. "If things go wrong here, or if things get weird, we need to move fast and someone needs to be in charge of that." "We've been doing okay so far," said Emma. "Besides," Steve added, "I've been leading." "No," said Bob. "I have." "What have you done, Nob?" "I got the food." "I told you to get the food." A dirty fist rapped against the window and made them jump. Bob let out a small squeal. A thin-faced man stared in at them, greasy hair swiped to one side. He wore dirty pants, dirty shirt, and dirt on his face, like it was too much of a bother to clean at the end of the world. "You got any food in there?" he said through the window. Bob reached over to open it. "Don't open it," Steve hissed without moving his lips. "We've got to," Bob explained. "He's right there and we can't stay in here." He tried the button, but the window didn't move. "Emma?" She twisted the key for power, and Bob cracked the window halfway. "We're getting our camp set up," Bob said, not quite answering him. "We all pitched in with food," the dirty man explained. "If you got any, you need to give it over and share." "We just got here," said Steve. "Don't matter none," the man said. "We're hungry. What you got?" He reached through the window and started patting for the inside handle. Bob swatted his hand. "Hey!" the dirty man shouted into the SUV. "Quit now." He grabbed for Bob, but the curly-haired boy fell over backwards and slid into the floorboard to keep out of reach. That freed up space for the man to grasp the handle and yank the door open. He dodged around it and started to root for the seat handle, so he could reach the back. Steve tackled him through the door. Both men landed on the ground in a squirming thud. The man shrieked as Steve landed a punch, then another. A second body ran around the back of the truck and tackled him off the man on the ground. "Bob," Emma yelled. "Help him." Bob scrambled out of the truck as the dirty man pulled himself off the ground and grinned. "You want some, fat boy?" the man leered. He held up his fists and advanced, legs open in a wide stance, and took a wild roundhouse swing at Bob. It wasn't skill that allowed the kid to avoid the blow, but his clumsy feet tripped over each other and he stumbled out of reach. The punch turned the man sideways at the waist, but he kept his feet planted. Bob twisted and sent a kick between his legs, which knocked the man to the dirt in a groaning heap. He turned to help Steve. His traveling partner was locked up in a stranglehold, the newcomer riding his back with both legs wrapped around his chest. Steve yanked and pulled at the arm that encircled his throat, but his face was turning blazing shades of purple and red. "Butt cheese!" Bob shouted a battle cry and ran to help Steve. Emma slammed her door open. The metal edge caught the side of the guy holding Steve. It sliced into the thin skin on his thick skull and knocked him to one side, blood cascading from the wound on his head. "Good one, Em," Bob congratulated. "Look out!" she pointed. The man he had kicked was up and stumbling forward for a sneak attack, dirty fist drawn back for a punch. The ranger rounded the large new RV in a rush. "Earl," he shouted in a whisper. The dirty man stopped and leaned against the SUV as he glared first at Bob, then at the ranger. "You know the noise attracts them, damn it," the ranger hissed. "They wouldn't share their food, Jimmy Ray," Earl muttered as he massaged his groin. "We is hungry." "I don't give a damn," said Jimmy Ray as he moved past Earl and checked on the bleeding guy dazed on the ground. "They just got here. They don't know the rules or the setup yet." Steve stood up and brushed himself off. "No, I'm fine, thanks for asking," he said. "I was coming to save you," said Bob. "Then she did it for me." "Get said some bandages." Jimmy Ray picked the man up off the ground and waited for Earl to grab his arm. "Then you guys do a perimeter sweep to make sure none of the dead are coming to see what the yelling was about." Earl glared at Steve and Bob as he limped his buddy away from their campsite. Jimmy Ray watched them go, then turned to the trio. "You haven't been here 5 minutes," he shook his head. "That's not making a good first impression." "He broke into my car," said Emma. "He was trying to take our stuff." Jimmy Ray held up a hand. "You took us by surprise," he said. "And there are some people here who aren't as prepared as others." They saw him look at the giant RV, then back at them. "I can catch you up on the particulars, but you need to set up a camp." He glanced into the back of the RV. "And if you do have some supplies you could spare, it might go a long way towards soothing hurt feelings." "My throat hurts more than my feelings," Steve croaked. Jimmy Ray shrugged. "If this wasn't an end-of-the-world type situation, then said would need stitches. As it is, let's just call it even." He took another look at the back of the truck. "Bring what you can share to the pavilion over there," he pointed. "We'll eat dinner together before dusk." He turned and slipped back around the front of the new RV. "What are we supposed to do till then?" Bob said as he stared at the empty space once occupied by the man. Steve moved past him and opened the back of the SUV. "We pitch a tent, Knob," he said as he began pulling out the camping gear from the spot he organized. Chapter 9. "I suppose it's something," said Bob. The tent was set up a few yards from the back of the truck, even with the edge of the rusty vintage camper. They still hadn't seen the owners of either rig that bracketed their camping spot, though several people had strolled past on the blacktop path that doubled as a road. Bob waved and said hi, but none of them returned the greeting. "It will do," Steve announced and wiped sweat from his brow. The tent was an older dome model, and would have popped up with ease had the tent poles been inside the bag. But Emma's grandfather had put together a collection of tent poles and stakes that looked to be an accumulation of camping trips of the past. None of which actually went with the nylon construction in the bag. Which left Steve to improvise. He did so with great gusto and a small amount of pride, ending with a tent-shaped sleeping structure on a cleared space on the ground. "It should keep out the rain," said Steve. "Bugs?" Emma asked. He nodded. "Creeps?" Bob whispered under his breath as yet another resident of the campground strolled past, watching them from the corner of their eyes. "Bugs yes, creeps TBD," said Steve. "I think we'll make a few friends when we share the food tonight." "That's what you hope," said Emma. "Otherwise, I'll have to rescue you again." "You can rescue me anytime you like," Steve wiggled his eyebrows. "Is that supposed to be flirting?" Bob snorted. "Is that your idea of it?" "Shut up, Knob," Steve snapped, but he was smiling. So was Emma, which was Bob's goal anyway, and so he smiled too. "We should keep the truck locked while we're away from it," said Emma in a low voice. The smiles evaporated as the seriousness of the situation intruded. "Yeah, that's a good idea," said Bob. "Should we carry the shotgun?" Again, his voice was pitched low, for their ears only. "I only see a few people armed," said Emma. "Maybe that's the rule. Maybe so everyone stays safe." "I don't know about you guys, but I want a shotgun in case we run across any of those undead," said Steve. "You could use a stick," said Emma. "You were good with it the other night." "That's what she said," Steve quipped. It drew a sniff of slight appreciation, and a snicker from Bob. "The tent's done," said the curly-haired boy. "Let's go explore." Chapter 10. They stepped around the edge of the new RV and studied the layout of the camp. There were rows of campers, RVs and tents that stretched on either side of smooth blacktop that cut through the woods in a meandering path that ended at a giant pavilion by the water. Beyond the picnic structure there was a man-made sand beach that stretched around three sides of the narrow peninsula that jutted out into the narrow lake. "This is not good," Bob whispered. "I don't like the way they're looking at us either," said Steve as he returned the baleful stares of a small group of people near the pavilion. "I mean the whole setup," Bob explained. "They should have picked a cove where maybe they'd do something to hide at night." "What the hell are you talking about, Knob?" "We're on a spit of land that just out into the lake," Bob said in a low slow voice, as if explaining it to a simpleton. "That means if we light up at night, fires or generators or whatever, then everything out there can see us. If they come here, we're trapped." "We would have been trapped in a cove too," said Emma. "Yeah, but a cove would have hidden us on a couple of sides at least." "Don't discount the truck across the road, Knob," said Steve. "A lot of thinking went into preparing this fortress." "That's what I mean." Bob's voice went up an octave as he started to argue. Emma placed a hand on his arm, which shut him up. "He's agreeing with you, Bob." "He is?" She nodded. "Oh," Bob stuttered. "I'm so used to, you know." He nodded toward Steve's back. "I know," she said as she tugged Bob after him. "Let's go see what we can find out." Steve stopped just shy of the group of 6 men and 2 women standing away from the pavilion. "Hello," he said in a greeting none of them bothered to return. "Friendly," Bob muttered under his breath as he came up behind Steve. "You the one that beat up Earl?" one of the men asked as he studied Steve from the tips of his sneakers to his mussed-up hair. Steve nodded until Bob shoved him aside. "Actually," said the brainy boy, "she did it." "Damn it, Knob." Steve straightened up and prepared for a fight. "It didn't come." The man who asked the question broke into a tight grin and glanced around at the others. "'Bout damn time someone did it." He stepped closer to the 3 teens. "I'm Keith." He held out a hand to Emma. She shook it and they made introductions with Steve and Bob. "I'm never going to remember your names," said Steve. "Forgive me if it takes a minute." "I've got it," Bob bragged. "Mary, Gina, Ray, Barry, Glenn, Dwight, Kevin, and Keith." He pointed to each of them in turn. "Impressive," said Keith as he stood back and ushered them into the pavilion. "Not really," said Bob. "I've just always been good with names. My dad used to make me show off at parties for people he worked with." "Your folks?" Keith raised his voice at the end of the sentence as it trailed off. Bob shrugged. "Gone Z," he said. "Z? Is that what you're calling them?" "Seems as good of a name as any," said Emma. "What do you call them?" "Forget what they're called," said the woman Bob called Gina. She had thick braids of dirty hair that cascaded down her back, and blooms of color in her cheek. "How did it get started?" Emma glanced from Bob to Steve and back again. "We don't know," she said. "It just sort of happened." Gina nodded, as if this was an answer she expected. "I just wondered if you had heard anything," she said. "Before the radios went out." She motioned to a picnic table moved to one corner of the covered pavilion, the outside edges blocked off with blue tarps tied to poles to keep the weather out. A large black radio that looked on the verge of being declared an antique rested on the table, a corded microphone next to it. The dial glowed a dim yellow, and Emma could see the needle bouncing in one of the tiny plastic windows, but no sound issued from the speakers. The volume was down. "Just static," said Bob. "And the one station that looped the emergency broadcast signal, but that was it. We gave up trying." "I had to turn it down," said Keith. "The static was driving me crazy." "Is that dinner?" Bob pointed to a pile of food in another corner of the pavilion. Boxes of dry goods, canned goods and sacks that weren't so easy to identify were stacked in neat rows along the concrete edge of the structure. "Jimmy Ray tell you we eat together?" Keith asked. Emma nodded. "It's partly a communal thing, and partly to take care of the less prepared." Steve couldn't help but notice his eyes dart toward a pickup truck camper parked in the very last spot on one of the rows. "If we call share," Keith sighed, "then we all survive." "For how long?" Gina asked. Keith silenced her with a hand gesture. "A lot of people here stick to themselves," he continued. "And that's okay. If you want to do that, it's fine. The folks next to you contributed, and then just stay inside their camper." "Which one?" Bob asked. "The big one," said Keith. Got here, turned in their food, and they stay inside and don't bother anyone. What's the end game? Steve asked. What do you mean? Bob says you're on a peninsula and that's a strategic mistake. Steve looked at the group. He says we're broadcasting our presence to anyone out there. But if no one is on the radio, and what we've seen out there, what's the goal? Rescue, said Mary. The government has got to be dealing with this. They have to have a plan. That's what I said, Bob told them. We're waiting, said Keith. We're surviving together until the authorities get here. Steve nodded, but he didn't look satisfied by that answer. Waiting was not in his nature. Emma saw him take a breath to say something and snagged his sleeve. Let's go get our food to turn in, she said. Steve frowned, but she tugged his sleeve again, and by the look on her face, he didn't want to argue with her. He slowly nodded and shuffled along with her. Need my help? Bob called after them. We've got it, said Emma. He watched them walk back toward the tent in front of the SUV, a look on his face that was easy to read, part longing, part envy. Chapter 11. What did you do that for? Steve asked when they were out of earshot. Don't rock the boat, she said. We're on land. Even worse, Emma told him. We're going to try and get along with everyone here. I can get along. Can you? Steve shrugged. If I try, I can. Will you? Are you going to just keep asking me questions to try and get the answers you want? She nodded. Okay, said Steve as he waited for her to fish the keys out of her jeans and click the unlock button on the fob. He opened the rear door. How much? She asked. He sorted through the food, setting aside enough for a couple of days for the three of them, and put the rest in a box. Less than half, he said. Emma looked back at the campsite. All these people, she said. It could get bad out here. Steve hoisted the box and shut the back door. That's why they're rationing, I bet. What will we do? Our best, he told her. Besides, I don't see anyone fishing and that lake has to be packed. Are you going to tell them that? Maybe, said Steve. Or maybe I'll show them. Lead by example. She followed him back to the pavilion. Chapter 12. Steve placed the box on the crowded table, noting the contents of the others nested next to it. It was an abundance of canned goods, boxed goods, and other food items like he had seen at a food drive the lacrosse team organized every Thanksgiving. He stepped back and noticed Nob standing by the water. There was a man next to him, one of the ones from the pavilion earlier, but Steve struggled to remember his name. The man had a fishing pole and was showing Bob how to cast into the still water of the lake. That's a good idea, he said aloud. What? Emma stopped next to him. Fishing, said Steve. He looked over the boxes again. They're using it to supplement, he said. Yes, said Jimmy Ray. We're trying to get ahead of it early. He studied Steve for a moment, taking his measure, as if he was surprised the boy noticed. Ahead of? Emma asked in a soft voice. There's not much food here, said Steve. It's a table full, Emma answered. We have enough for a week, said Jimmy Ray. He glanced around at the campers, the tents and the people in the campground. Some looked busy, but a lot more were sitting outside of their respective abodes. Maybe two, the ranger continued. Then what? Steve asked. The older man shrugged. Then it gets tough. This thing isn't even a week old, Steve started to argue, but stopped as Jimmy Ray shook his head. Here it's just a week, he said. But out there, it's been longer. On the other side of the lake? Other states, the ranger said. We heard rumors of it, then by the time someone tried to get ahead of it, it was too late. What happened? Jimmy Ray shrugged and shook his head in such a sense of helplessness, Steve felt bad for asking. That's just it, he said. We don't know what happened. It's all rumor and talk, but no one knows anything. Except this. He pointed to the campgrounds. Which might not last a week, Emma said. It won't, Jimmy Ray told her. Not once the food is gone. She wanted to feel shocked, but tried it and couldn't. The matter-of-fact tone of his voice, combined with the last few nights for her, left no room for surprise or shock or any of the other feelings that she thought she should be having. Instead, there was a sense of resignation. This is how it was going to be. And resolve. Just another problem to solve in a series of problems. She imagined there would be a lot more problems before it was all done. Why don't you have more people fishing? Asked Steve. Or hunting? Jimmy Ray grimaced. Because if he starts giving orders, "People will get mad," said Emma, reading his face. "But you're the leader here, right?" Again the ranger grimaced. "I'm an authority figure," he said. "And people like to blame authority figures when things go wrong." "That's crazy," Steve started to say. But then he remembered the abandoned cop cars and military roadblocks they came across. "It is crazy," Emma agreed. "Maybe if we told them about the situation, they would do more to help." "Some," Jimmy Ray agreed. "But some might decide to take the food. Take from the weak, and then it becomes a riot." Bob yelled in joy from the side of the lake and held up a silver fish that flashed in the sunlight. "Quiet," Jimmy Ray whispered. He stared at the trees on the other side of the lake. Long shadows turned the forest into an impenetrable twilight after a few feet and he couldn't see much further. Bob rushed back toward the pavilion, holding the fish aloft like a treasure, a grin stretching his cheeks wide as his curly mane bounced. "Patrol," Jimmy Ray announced and left to circumnavigate the perimeter. "Hey guys, look," said Bob, presenting the fish in outstretched hands. "We heard Knob," said Steve. "We can't yell like that anymore. They'll hear you." "Who? Them?" He nodded toward Earl and a few others as they advanced on the pavilion. Steve slowly turned his head to watch them. "The dead ones," Emma told Bob. "But yeah, them too." Earl sauntered past, giving the stink eye to Steve, a sneer plastered on his face. "He's gonna be trouble," Steve said. "Then we should make a plan," said Emma. "Plan for what?" Bob still held the fish. "Making a run for it." Chapter 13. They expected a week. They discussed it with Bob on the way back to the SUV and their tent. Steve showed them the food he kept behind and Emma insisted they hide it better. Under blankets would be good, but under the seat and in a hidden space in the way back under the floor. Then it was time for dinner. Bob led the way to the pavilion. The sun was on its westward trajectory down. "There's kind of a curfew," Bob told them. "Dwight said Jimmy Ray keeps everyone in their camps at night so it's safer." "Sounds safe," said Emma in a distracted sort of way. Like she was thinking of far-off places. "My fish is getting cut up and made into stew," Bob bragged. "Were you the only one who caught anything?" Steve asked. Bob shrugged. "Probably," he said. "But I don't know." He added the last part in a low voice and when they reached the pavilion, they could see he was not the only one who had caught a fish that day. The pot for stew was a large industrial model, stainless steel perched on a cast-iron grill over a small fire. Steve could see several more fires pop up in small iron rings in front of the campers and RVs, and wondered again if they were just inviting trouble. The smell of the fish stew filled the area around the pavilion, and the three teens joined a line. Emma handed them each a styrofoam bowl and a plastic spoon and they waited for the watery mix to be ladled into them. The fish was supplemented with canned vegetables and floating pieces of pasta, but there wasn't much of it. It took Bob less than 3 minutes to polish of his bowl, then he watched Emma and Steve while they ate, just in case they wanted to share. "This is going to get bad," said Emma. "It's not bad," Bob said. "If you don't want it, I'll take yours." He reached out for the bowl, but Emma held it closer to her chest. "She's talking about this camp, Knob," Steve said. The three of them sat in a tight circle on the edge of the firelight. "It was your idea to come here," Bob said. He ran his spoon across the bottom of the bowl again to scrape up any drops and bits he might have missed. Steve looked at them both and lowered his head. "I was wrong." Bob grinned. "Quarterback punk," he snorted. "Wrong sport, Knob." Bob snickered. "The idea's the same. And I've never heard you say you were wrong before." "Perfect? Yeah, you told me that." "Amazing? Once or twice on a wedgie run." "But wrong? I didn't think you could say the word." "We were all wrong, Bob," said Emma. "We came here together." "I said we should find the army," Bob pointed with the spoon. "Army's gone," said Earl. They didn't hear him sneak up on them as he plopped between Steve and Emma. "All of them," Earl growled. "Ain't no one left to protect you." He leered at Emma. Steve put his bowl down and reached for Earl's shirt. Said and another guy dropped on either side of him, pinned his arms to his side. Earl reached over and took Emma's bowl from her hand. "Like I said, we's hungry." He took the last few bites of her stew. "And you should share." His eyes roved over Emma. "You like sharing, don't you?" Emma slapped him. Earl held a hand to his bleeding lip and stared at the crimson stain on his pale skin. "All right then," he held out her bowl. When Emma reached for it, he punched her. The blow knocked her sideways. Steve tried to pounce, but the two other men held him tight. Bob bellowed and surged toward Earl. He landed on top of him, tight fists pummeled the dirty man. 3 blows landed in awkward thumps before Earl rolled out from under Bob and shoved him away. By that time, the struggle had attracted the other campers. Jimmy Ray ran from the other side of the pavilion and yanked Earl away from the teens. Seth and the other guy let Steve go and he rushed to help Emma get up. "We don't need this, Earl." Jimmy Ray shoved the grimy man away. "They got food, Jimmy Ray," Earl whined. "They holding out on us." "I saw what they brought." Jimmy Ray shoved him back again. "They still got more in their truck. We saw them hiding it. Ain't that right, Seth?" Seth nodded. Jimmy Ray glared at Steve. "Is that true?" "We gave you half," said Steve. "That ain't all now, is it?" Earl sneered. "We don't know you," said Bob. "And I gave you all my fish." Jimmy Ray stared at the curly-haired boy. The ridiculousness of it made him snort, and once he did, Keith and Dwight joined in. "Yeah," said Jimmy Ray. "You did give us the whole fish, didn't you?" "All of it," said Bob. He stood on the other side of Emma, holding her arm tight. "See, Earl," Jimmy Ray said. "They're trying. And they're learning, which is more than I can say for you." "Screw you, Jimmy Ray," said Earl. "Come on," said. The 3 men marched back toward their truck. Jimmy Ray moved closer to the teens. "This won't work if we can't trust you," he said. "It's getting dark and I've got everyone on a curfew so we can stay safe. I want you to think about it tonight and let's see where you stand in the morning." "You're just going to let them get away with hitting her?" Steve asked. Jimmy Ray watched him a minute. "What do you want me to do?" He said it in such a way Steve knew nothing would happen. They watched him go and the crowd that had gathered around dispersed back to their campsites. "We have to clean this up," Keith called after Jimmy Ray as he stood by the pot. "Leave it till morning," Jimmy Ray said. He picked his shotgun up from one of the tables and began patrolling the blacktop path. Emma, Steve and Bob watched him go, then walked back to their tent in silence. Chapter 14. The fires in the iron rings in front of several campsites threw orange glows that flicked in the night. But the large RV on one side cast their campsite in shadowed darkness. The dark windows of it in the vintage camper kept them from building a fire of their own. "Where are they?" Bob wondered. "Just focus, Knob," Steve said. "Yeah, I am. But don't you think it's weird?" "It is weird, yes," said Steve. He stared into the darkness, willing his pupils to go even wider, wishing more light from the crescent moon and the blinking stars leaked through the overhead canopy of branches and leaves. "But we've been here all day and no one's gone in or out," Bob whispered. "You said that," Steve told him. "Yeah, but what does it mean?" They didn't see the men approach the tent. It was too dark. One moment, it was silent and still, and the next, thudding wax on nylon echoed across the campsite. "Now," said Steve. Emma stepped on the brakes and bathed their tent in crimson light. The 3 men attacking the empty tent with sticks and bats threw up their hands and arms to fight the glare. Steve ran at them, a stick of his own in hand. He rammed the end into Seth's gut and cracked him across his wounded skull with the other. The third guy turned to run. His feet tangled in the collapsed fabric of the tent and he pitched forward with a yell that ended with a grunt. Steve whacked him across the base of the head with the stick and spun into Earl. Earl danced back and brought his stick up to parry the blow. The man and the teen whacked and cracked at each other with the sticks. Emma let her foot off the brake and smashed it down again. The flicker of the brake light caught Steve off guard. Earl slipped in under a swing and jabbed the edge of his stick against the side of Steve's head. It knocked the boy over backwards on top of the third man's inert body. Earl grinned, raised the stick to smash it down in an overhead arc. The click-clack of a shotgun racking echoed across the campsite. "Don't move," Bob said. One side of his face was bathed in red light from the brakes, the other in darkness as he glared at Earl, the shotgun not quite pointed at him. Earl dropped the stick and turned on Bob. "You're not going to shoot me, kid?" He took a step toward Bob. Bob backed up until the back of his legs hit the bumper and he could go no further. "I say don't move," his voice warbled. Earl lunged for the shotgun, grabbed it by the barrel and yanked it from Bob. The boy's finger caught on the trigger and blasted a shot into the trees. The roar bounced across the lake, followed by Earl's scream. He held up a hand missing 4 fingers, jets of blood that looked black in the brake light spurting across his face. He screamed again. Jimmy Ray ran around the front of the giant RV, a flashlight bouncing in one hand, his shotgun in the other. Who? What? He screamed. Fear and anger made it hard for him to articulate. Earl held out his hand and Jimmy Ray dodged back before the blood could land on him. It missed his shirt and pants, but still landed on his boots. Earl screamed and sprinted past the ranger, running off into the darkness, the howl of his voice bouncing off the trees. Too much noise. Steve sat up and held his injured head. "Give me that." Jimmy Ray tried to yank the shotgun out of Bob's hands. "That's how the last guy got shot." Bob clenched the shotgun to his chest. "You're freaking kidding me, right?" Jimmy Ray reached for it again. Earl's scream changed from one of intense pain to sheer terror. It bounced off the trees and off the water and was joined by another on the far side of camp. Jimmy Ray looked over his shoulder, and the last thing Bob saw on his face was fear as Emma lifted her foot off the brakes. "Get in your truck." Jimmy Ray let go of the rifle and shoved it into Bob. "Get out of here." He turned and ran past Steve as more screams joined the others. "What's going on?" Emma stepped out of the truck. Their campsite was too dark again to see. "We need a light," Bob said. He fumbled with the shotgun and opened the back hatch. Then he fumbled around inside searching for a flashlight by feel. "A little help here," said Steve. "I can't see." "Give me a minute," Bob called over his shoulder. Another camper screamed, closer this time, and they could hear footsteps pounding on the blacktop as people ran by them. A shotgun blast roared, followed quickly by another. "We don't have a minute, Knob," said Steve. Emma climbed back in the driver's seat and pressed the brakes. "Does that help?" "It's outside the truck," Bob said. "Oh wait, yeah, here you go." He clicked on the light as he turned back to the campsite, blinking away the afterimage and squinting as his eyes adjusted. The beam of light played across the dark vintage camper and settled on Steve in the ruins of the collapsed tent. The body of the third man sat up next to the boy, grabbed his shoulders and snapped at his neck. Steve made an animal noise of terror and rage as he shoved against the man's chest and tried to hold off the gnashing teeth. Bob screamed. Emma jumped out of the driver's seat and ran to the back of the truck. "Bob," she yelled, her hands slamming against the flat empty floorboard inside the door. "Light." Bob moaned and turned the light toward her. It bounced across the two struggling bodies wrestling on the tent fabric. She beat it down toward the floor, gave a small cry of triumph and turned with the shotgun in her hand. She aimed at the dead guy and pulled the trigger. It clicked dry. Steve groaned louder. The third man moaned, leaned in as the boy's grip slipped. Bob reached up, racked the shotgun with one hand while Emma held it with the other. She took 2 steps toward the tent and blasted the guy off Steve. Emma bent down to help him up and saw the side of his head was covered with blood. "Yours or his?" she asked. Steve reached up and winced as he touched the wound. "Mine," he said. "Bob, help him," Emma instructed. Bob stumbled forward and grabbed Steve by the arm. He steered him to the passenger side and tried to put him in the back seat. "Shotgun," Steve moaned. "No way," Bob said. "I'm riding up front." Steve slipped and stumbled. Bob flinched and tried to catch him. But Steve grabbed the door handle and cracked the front door open. He tumbled into the front seat and grinned through the window in a dazed and confused fog at Bob. "No fair," Bob said as he slid into the back seat and slammed the door. Emma jumped behind the wheel and passed the gun back to Bob. "Don't use it," she said. "Unless we have to?" She waited a moment then nodded. "Okay, unless we have to." She started the truck, dropped it in gear and backed out onto the blacktop. A camper ran up to them and pounded on the glass, beat the door. "Now?" Bob grunted as he stared with wide eyes at the person trying to break in. "Not yet," said Emma. She dropped the truck in drive and dodged people as she raced for the exit. A crowd of dead bodies walking up the road blocked the way. "Now?" Bob squealed. Emma grit her teeth and slowed down. "Not yet," she said. "You're slowing down," Steve pointed out. "Too fast and they could damage the truck," she said as they reached the crowd and began knocking them aside and down. "Too slow in their roadkill," said Steve as the truck rocked up and over small crunching mounds of former people. Then they were through and the road ahead was empty. Almost. Earl sprinted out of the trees and jumped on the running boards of the truck next to Steve. He smashed his elbow against the glass, spit flying from his open mouth as he screamed in rage. "Now?" Bob bellowed. "Now!" Emma shrieked back. Bob hit the electric window. It dropped automatically. Halfway down, he racked the shotgun, aimed and pulled the trigger. Chapter 15. How do you propose we do this? Bob asked from the back seat. We hide, said Emma as she gripped the wheel with both hands, tears streaming from her eyes. A bunched strand of hair had worked its way loose from the tight ponytail and whipped in the wind through the cracked window. We keep quiet and we hide. Hide where? Steve asked in a tired-sounding voice. He longed to reach out and tuck the hair behind her ear, to put his hand on her shoulder again and lend her support, comfort, whatever she needed. He knew if he did, Bob would too, and instead of hoping that comfort from the two of them would work twice as much, he resented it. He thought it would make his offer only a half measure. He hated the part of him that thought this, hated that it even crossed his mind. But it did, and stuck there, like grit in shoes, rubbing a raw spot on his self-esteem. So he kept his hand to himself and instead watched her hair whip around in the wind like a ribbon. We need to find a place to hide, said Emma. Until daylight. Like a cave? Bob leaned forward from the back seat. I don't know of any caves around here. Not a cave, Knob. What's your bright idea then, pretty boy? A house, said Emma. We can use houses to hide overnight. I thought we were going camping, said Steve. Yeah, that turned out well, said Bob. He's injured, Emma said. It might knock some sense into him, Bob sniffed. But if that was the case then all the hits to the head when he was playing would have done it before. Emma reached the ranger's truck that blocked the entrance. As her headlights washed over the side panels, she saw Jimmy Ray run from the woods and jump into the driver's side. The truck started and pulled away from them, opening the road so she didn't have to squirt through the mud on the side. They reached the intersection and turned. They drove in silence until they reached a tiny town, what some people called a map. When they were driving through, and what the people who lived there referred to as a quaint community. It was a collection of houses built on a small grid off the crossroads, stretching back 6 streets in either direction. The houses were dark, little more than shapes in the night. Where is everyone? Bob whispered from the back seat. Use the light, Knob, said Steve. He seemed to be coming around more. Emma supposed he was used to knocks on the head like Bob said. Bob clicked on the flashlight and played it across the houses as Emma drove down one street and took a right turn. They passed a house. Then another. Cars missing from the driveways. Garages left open. Front doors open. Like the people inside just left or disappeared. We'll have to be careful though, she warned them. In case there are, you know, inside. Zombies, said Bob. They're zombies. That sounds like such a stupid movie, said Steve. Zombies. It's trite. Whoa, $2 word from the 10-cent mind, said Bob. I didn't know you knew what that meant. Shove it, Knob. Up your ass, Bob answered. Quit it, said Emma. If you guys keep this shit up, I'm putting you out and you can make bicker all you want without me. Bicker, said Bob. Like an old married couple, she said. Gross, Bob and Steve said at the same time. Bob snickered. Steve didn't. Jinx, said Bob. You owe me a Coke. What would you call them then? Z-Men? Said Steve. Real original. Besides, there are women zombies too. Steve shrugged. Z then? Just Z? Asked Emma. Sure. Z. All right, now we have a name for the enemy. Now where are we going to hide from them? There, Emma pointed to a house that looked empty. That's a good place to start. And she wheeled the truck into the driveway. The adventure continues in no entry.